everyone. Again, my name is Jen Ryan, and I'm going to be talking about the violence of low expectations and poor educational outcomes. I'm also going to make some connections to understandings of self and employment as well. So I've selected these three quotes to kind of start the presentation and kind of frame it. The first one is from Dr. Chris Spence, the Director of Education for TDSB. And this is from a TED Talk that he did. We have to make a simple but powerful commitment to all of our students, and the opportunity to pursue their dreams will be constrained only by the limits of their imaginations and never their postal codes. And I wanted to highlight that quote kind of as we move forward because I think it really speaks to the alignment between what the United Way has been doing and the Act for Youth project. Because I'm also going to be speaking about stigma, I've included this next quote because I think it really gets at the power of stigma to shape the experience of youth and how youth experience their communities. It says perceptions of the neighborhood in which people live are just as important as the neighborhoods themselves. And this final quote comes from a youth participant within our research, and it really looks at the power of stigma and the feeling of disconnect that it creates. The people looking in from the outside won't resist or rebel against the injustices that are occurring because they already have a negative image of the people there. They feel like the things that are happening to them are what they deserve. So, Philip and Alex spoke about spaces of exclusion earlier, and I'm not going to get too much into that, but this is a bit of an outline. I'm going to talk about a cycle that we saw emerge from our data, and then talk about opportunities kind of for disrupting that cycle. Again, this is the piece on spaces of exclusion. I just want to point out again how critical it is to understand spaces of exclusion and what that means for lacking equal access to key institutions and long-term well-being, and that there are a multitude of reasons for relations of exclusion, which makes it kind of difficult to understand them. So I just wanted to highlight that before we move forward. Okay. So. Today I'm really presenting on this cycle we've called the cycle of stigma. And I want to tell you kind of how we got there because I think the process is kind of interesting. Uzo spoke about the structure of ACT, and Henry talked about ACT as well. We have 5 working groups. And of those 5 working groups, each working group has kind of engaged in multiple lines of inquiry and different research projects. And what that means is that in the fall, when we came to the table and decided to start trying to think about overarching themes and integrating the findings, that it was really kind of overwhelming because we are very data rich. We have a lot of incredible information. So what we did, and I think often we don't have the luxury to do this, but it really shaped what we were able to see in the end. We sat around a table for a couple of hours a week or every 2 weeks over the course of a couple of months. And there would be academic partners, community members, different people representing the working groups, youth. Sometimes we had visiting scholars, different service providers. And we just talked about the findings, and we talked and we talked. And eventually we started to see some kind of relationships develop, and we saw some patterns. And am I talking into this all right? Can everyone hear me? Okay. And then we saw some patterns emerge, and eventually a cycle started to take shape. And that's what I want to talk about today. But it was because we had the time to kind of go through. It was really an incredible process. So now I want to look a little bit at stigma. Yeah. So a lot of our discussions kept coming back to issues of stigma and practices of stigma and feelings around stigma. And stigma is a kind of contested term. Not everyone likes it because they say that it focuses on the attributes of the stigmatized population and kind of speaks as though stigma just appears out of thin air. What I want to highlight is that we're using definitions that speak to very specific power relationships that create feelings of stigma, and that it is very limiting in terms of access to important life domains. Discrimination directly affects the social status, psychological well-being, and physical health of the stigmatized. Okay. So this is the, there's some funny formatting, but this is the cycle of stigma that we're seeing. And I want to note that all communities are always kind of existing in this tension between the forces of exclusion, lack of social supports, media framing, all kinds of things that kind of alienate populations. And then on the other side, we have really rich experiences of community. So this cycle is kind of happening between those forces, and all communities kind of exists between those forces. Can we just go back for a second? Sorry. And I know a lot of people get alarmed when they see a really neat and tidy model. Life is a lot messier than I can ever represent on a slide. And I just want to say that this is a pattern that we're kind of seeing develop. It's not really super deterministic. We're not saying this is a route that all youth follow. It's just something that we're seeing from the data that we have. So in terms of stigma, the first point on the top, we have stigma in the production of negative discourse. So we have the ideas of stigma, the attitudes and beliefs that come along with stigma. At the second point, we have the violence of low expectations, and those are the practices that are informed by stigma. So people who are working on the front lines, people who are engaging with youth that have kind of ideas and perhaps low expectations based on understandings of stigma towards the population. And then the third point on this cycle is called the self-fulfilling prophecy, or the performance marginality. And what that looks at is how youth understand and are aware of those low expectations that they experience at this point, and how sometimes when enough people are placing limits on you and have low expectations for you, you start to perform to those low expectations. And that's kind of the cycle that we're seeing take shape. So looking at the first point in a little bit more detail, the ideas. And this is kind of where some of our reframing data came in. When we started to look at how ideas about the Jane and Finch neighborhood are circulated, naturally we decided to kind of look at mainstream media. A critical discourse analysis was done on approximately 148 texts, and they were mainstream newspaper articles. And what this research demonstrated is that those persistent old frames of violence, of fiscal irresponsibility, the idea that Jane and Finch is somehow a threat to the rest of the community that must be contained, all of those really negative frames still exist. But there is a shift to a nominally more positive frame. And an example of that frame is one of a story of individual success. Somebody gets a scholarship or someone wins a spelling bee. And it's a positive story for that person. But the way the story frames the community is one that it has to be survived. And what makes this story kind of newsworthy is that this youth kind of triumphs from the community to achieve success. So what happens in these stories is that they've kind of buried the negative framing a little bit, which in some way makes it even more dangerous because you don't recognize it right away, but you're taking it in. And then we also looked at policy. We looked at how social policy is a communicative act and how it communicates values and understandings to populations. And an example of perhaps misguided policy is a priority neighborhood strategy that was created to really funnel incredible resources and support into communities where it was needed, but at the same time, community members felt stigmatized by the label of priority. So sometimes these policies, many of these are really well-intentioned, but they have the effect of further stigmatizing populations. So we went in to do interviews. And it was interesting, our interviews with academics, media, policy, service providers, they really talked about, yes, stigma is coming from the media. We know that. Sometimes stigma is coming from policy, but it's something that we're all doing all the time. As researchers, we create funding proposals that use the terms marginalized community. And as service providers, we use those frames also when we're trying to secure fundings and critical program support. And of course, we're familiar with the media and policy. So it's something that we have to kind of reflect on and look at and really understand how we're all kind of engaging this and we're all implicated in it in many ways. So looking at practice, I'm going to talk about education, employment, community together. And this is something that Uzo really spoke to earlier when she was looking at the survey. I'm going to just let you kind of look at these quotes because I think they really capture better than I can what people are saying in terms of how they're aware of and understanding low expectations. says it doesn't matter if you have a university degree or you have a college degree. Once you're living in Jane and Finch and you apply for a job, your postal code becomes an issue. There's a lack of employment, there's a lack of opportunities for education, there's also a lack of role models in the community as well. And this quote I think is interesting because it speaks to kind of an awareness that it's not an individual thing. The guidance counselors, I don't think they did their job in trying to, or weren't able to do their job in trying to get children motivated for post-secondary education or college or whatever, careers, because they were so focused on trying to get kids into courses. So there's an understanding that this isn't an individual experience. This is something that systems are supporting. This is a systemic issue, and that it's not about the individual teachers and guidance counselors, but it's that sometimes they don't have the support and the resources they need to do the jobs they want to do. And here are some more quotes. It hurts when other people say these things. Career class was a joke. In career class, the teacher we had, everyone was running around wild and no one cared. It wasn't very inspirational. So these quotes are kind of demonstrating that understanding of low expectation. So the third point, the performance marginality, or the performance to kind of those lowered expectations. This is a term that comes from cognitive psychology. And it says perceptions of negative, and I want to include it because it speaks to kind of how this process happens. It says perceptions of negative stereotypes and expectations can lead perceivers to behave towards their stigmatized targets in ways that directly affect the target's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. The target's behavior then may confirm the initial erroneous expectation. So that kind of talks about how these messages are internalized, and people have, in the interviews, you've talked about a feeling of scriptedness. They kind of had a sense of what people expected for them down the road. And what I want to say is, because we're looking at this model, is that, again, there's tremendous variability in terms of how people respond to stigma, and I can't state that enough, that we're not saying that this is exactly how all youth are impacted, but that this is something that is very real and happening according to our data. So here I've just kind of pulled out, in terms of the literature on stigma, a couple of examples of how people talk about youth or any population really responding to issues of stigma. The first one is embracing or reinforcing. Conscious and unconscious internalization of the message, buying into the stigma and performing to the low expectations, which is kind of what I had just spoke about. The other one is rejecting the stigma as negative and embracing the frame. And that comes out in our interviews about TERF, in examples of hypermasculinity, and something that Foster refers as the commodification of the thug, or kind of the glamorization of what he calls thug culture. Overcompensating overachievers who recognize the negative frame and then try to aggressively counteract it. And then transcending clearly the most ideal frame that many youth kind of do not appear to be so impacted by the stigma. Two that we're seeing in the data, and Foster doesn't really speak to, one is resisting, telling another story through activism, art, and finding one's own voice to tell another story. And the other one is opting out. A lot of youth talk about feeling pressures to not identify as Jane and Finch. When they're in different social settings, people remove themselves from the community and go to other schools. And I'd just like to say, actually, some of those responses don't look so bad, some look better than others, and it's never just one or the other. These are happening in different ways, and people can move in and out of different forms, but the reality is that they're all distorted versions of self. So youth are always negotiating with that stigmatized identity, and what that does is it distracts people from being able to just be who they are. They're always kind of in this negotiated identity. So in terms of performance, here are some quotes from youth where they talk about that feeling of the self-fulfilling prophecy and the expectations. If you hear the same thing over and over about you, where you live, some part of you is going to believe it. So what happens when you have all these negative thoughts and negative things happening in newspapers and in the media and about residents of Jane and Finch youth? They automatically assume that role. Those are just examples of people kind of articulating these feelings. Again, this one kind of gets to the resistance that I go out and I use my kind of creative voice to kind of tell another story and to try and kind of counteract that frame. And this looks at kind of the opting out. I'm always told by other people to not say you're from Jane and Finch, to not bring the hood or community wherever you go. So, disrupting cycles of stigma, getting to over, under, and through. This is a quote I used at the beginning, and I want to kind of pull it back again, because in terms of starting to think about intervention, stigma is very difficult because it comes from so many different places and happens on so many levels, which makes it seem just completely overwhelming and kind of like a helpless or a hopeless cause. But theorists and people who work in stigma say that's actually the really incredible thing. That's where the real opportunity is, because there are so many opportunities for intervention. It's something that everyone can engage in, happening on individual, sociocultural, institutional levels. And of course, naturally, getting to the roots of stigma is important, but very difficult to do. So the data is telling us that family and personal supports are in place, and this looks at Uzo's her presentation earlier, that family and personal supports are in place. Youth feel cared for by parents and guardians who take an interest in their education. Youth feel powerful, optimistic. They report liking themselves, glad to be themselves, motivation for achievement, and positive view of the personal future. As Uzo noted, these numbers appear to be very positive indicators, but when we kind of look into the future and speak with youth who are in the labor market, they express feelings of kind of hopelessness, of being unprepared for the realities of the labor market, and regretful that they didn't pursue further post-secondary education. So we're seeing a real disconnect in terms of how youth imagine their future and how they experience it. There's a resilience and an optimism that's not translating into personal success and well-being. And we really feel that stigma plays a key role in the lack of that translation. It's a paralyzing role, and it's contributing kind of to a lack of institutional investment in youth. From what the surveys say, communities are not creating or effectively communicating. The opportunities might be there, but they're not effectively communicating opportunities for service, volunteerism, mentorship, and the education system is not sufficiently daring youth to excel. And these are just two examples, really, of how to bridge that optimism that we see in high school with long-term well-being. And according to youth, they're not feeling that these supports are there to sufficiently support them in making that transition. Okay. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's it, sorry. So when we want to better understand asset development in youth, we have to really flip this model and stop looking at into the community of Jane and Finch and asking how youth and families are lacking or different, even though often this work is very well-intentioned and comes from a very good place, and consider the larger systemic institutional failures and issues of stigma. So it's about using the concept of stigma to inform our own practices as educators, researchers, service providers, policymakers, and media. And we have to understand kind of how we're all implicated in these larger cycles of stigma and low expectation, make visible those limits that we are creating and communicating to youth. So it becomes a kind of, it's about not asking what's wrong with the community or how can we fix a community. It's about asking what's wrong with how we talk about this community, what's wrong with how we're thinking about this community, and what's wrong with really what we expect from this community. So if you have any questions or comments, I can take them down. We're just in the process of layering in. You might be from a working group and you're not quite seeing your information, your data reflected here, but we're just starting to kind of layer it into this model. So if you have any suggestions also on how it might